Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Simon O'Kane and I'm going to talk about my paper on lithium-ion battery degradation. In green are the primary degradation mechanisms that can occur inside a lithium-ion battery. On the graphite-based negative electrode, you have SEI formation and lithium plating. On the metal oxide-based positive electrode, you have transition metal dissolution and structural disordering. And in both you get mechanical fracture. All of these trigger secondary mechanisms, which are shown in red, and all of those can affect the performance of the battery. So here is a map of this maze of degradation that can occur when the primary mechanisms kick off various secondary mechanisms and all of them interact with each other. And these interactions trigger the various degradation modes, which can be measured by bespoke experiments. And those in turn trigger the capacity fade and power fade that we're all familiar with. One of the research questions we wanted to answer when we started out on this study is what causes the sudden capacity drop that occurs at the end of a battery's life, which is also called the cliff edge or rollover. Shankar Lin's team blamed manganese dissolution at the positive electrode. Xiaoguang Yang's team blamed the SEI causing pore clogging, causing runaway lithium plating. Christian Cooper's team blamed the SEI growth causing consumption and loss of the electrolyte. Renier, Mulder and Howie blamed mechanically induced loss of active material that occurs as the particles expand and contract while the cell's being cycled. So every modeling paper we've looked at seems to have a different answer, and we have a different answer again. Our model focuses on the graphite-based negative electrode. The metal oxide-based positive electrode is going to come within scope for future work. So the first degradation mechanism we consider is SEI growth on the surface of the particle. Cracks propagate from the surface towards the center, and the SEI can grow on those cracks as well as on the surface. If the crack goes all the way through, that results in a bit of graphite floating off and doing nothing, so you get loss of active material, quite literally. Lithium plating can also occur, and sometimes the lithium metal that's plated can break off to form dead lithium, which again floats surrounding the electrolyte doing nothing. This is the same model, but in a flowchart form. So here you have the 4 different degradation mechanisms we're considering, and they're also linked together. So the SEI affects how much lithium is plated, but the plating can also react with electrolyte to form this dead lithium. Cracks expose new surface area for rapid SEI growth. The 2 different mechanical mechanisms are both governed by stress-strain relations, so you only calculate the stress-strain relation once and then calculate both of the degradation mechanisms based on those. The loss of active material also affects the surface area to volume ratio, and that in turn affects everything. So for all of our degradation studies, we've cycled the cell 1,000 times. One of the luxuries of a model is you can switch different degradation mechanisms on and off as you see fit. So for the first part of the study, we've just enabled SEI growth and lithium plating, turning off the mechanical mechanisms. And to get the most lithium plating, we've turned down the cell to 5 degrees. On the bottom left, you can see the equation that I've used for lithium plating. It has a reversible term and an irreversible term. And so you also have two adjustable constants, the reversible constant K and the irreversible constant gamma. We've tried varying those to see what happens. On the left is your usual plot of capacity versus charge throughput, but that doesn't tell us very much. It's a very crowded plot. So on the right are what happens after the 1,000 cycles when you turn the temperature back up to 25 degrees. And that shows a much clearer picture. Obviously, when you turn up the irreversible decay constant, the amount of degradation goes up. The effect of the reversible constant is more complicated. If it's very small and you turn it up, you see a lot more degradation. But if it's already quite large and you turn it up even further, the rate of degradation doesn't change very much. And that's because if the reversible constant is much larger than the irreversible constant, all that happens is the extra lithium is stripped back into the electrolyte where it can be used again. Next, we've turned off the plating, turned on particle cracking, and gone back to 25-degree cycling. And what happens is you see exactly the sort of cliff edge failure that I showed you earlier for the higher cracking rates. The higher the cracking rate, the sooner it occurs. And on the left is capacity, on the right is the loss of lithium inventory, and the loss of lithium inventory just skyrocketed. Why is it skyrocketing? If you look on the right here, you can see what's happening. After a while, the crack starts growing so fast, the SEI can't passivate it anymore. And therefore, the average SEI thickness actually decreases. And so instead of the SEI being self-limiting, it's now self-starting. You get positive feedback instead of negative feedback. On the left, you can see why the cell just fails suddenly. It's because the porosity goes to 0, which completely shuts off the cell. Now we've turned all the mechanisms off except for the mechanical loss of active material. One problem is we don't actually know what the yield stresses of these electrodes are because they're composite materials. We do know that the NMC metal oxide has a much higher Young's modulus than graphite, so we've assumed that to have a much larger yield stress. And therefore, in this study, turning up the degradation constant for the positive electrode didn't change very much. But if you turn up the same constant for the negative electrode, you're seeing this positive feedback, because as you lose active material but keep the current the same, you're forcing the same amount of current through less material, which increases the mechanical stress, and you therefore get a vicious cycle, which is what Grenier, Mulder, and Howie predicted in their modeling study. Finally, instead of focusing on one or two mechanisms and changing the numbers we put into the model, we're now turning on all the mechanisms, keeping the numbers the same, and varying the cycling conditions. And what you see is that extreme temperatures seem to be worse than high currents. For low temperature, the loss of lithium inventory is high because of lithium plating. For high temperature, it's high because of SEI, and we've assumed the SEI to have an Arrhenius dependence on temperature. But the loss of lithium inventory isn't big enough to explain the huge drop of capacity that occurs at 5 degrees. What does explain it is the loss of active material, and that's because the diffusion coefficient of lithium ions inside the graphite also has an Arrhenius temperature dependence. So at low temperature, the diffusion is slowed down, and you therefore get higher concentration gradients inside the particles, which leads to more stress and more loss of active material. So we found 5 pathways through this maze of degradation that I showed you at the beginning. The best case scenario is the solid green line, where you have medium temperature and SEI dominated degradation. And because the SEI is self-inhibiting, that leads to slow capacity loss and a long life. At low temperature, you get more lithium plating that's not self-inhibiting, and so the capacity degrades faster. At high current and low temperature, you get that mechanical damage to the electrodes that I talked about. Fast discharge damages the negative electrode, fast charge damages the positive electrode. Worst of all is when you have fast discharge and a high cracking rate, which causes that runaway SEI growth, clogging the pores and leading to that cliff edge failure. What have we learned on our journey through the degradation maze? Well, we proposed a new set of equations for partially reversible lithium plating with 2 rate constants that have different effects on the degradation. SEI on cracks consumes more lithium than SEI on the initial surface, which agrees nicely with other models in the literature. Pore clogging from SEI growth on cracks can cause rapid sudden failure. We have a loss of active material model, but there are a lot of unknown parameters, and therefore that model needs more experimental validation. For this parameter set, extreme temperatures cause more degradation than high currents. But then you could argue if we used higher currents, we would get a different outcome. Our model has more detailed physics than other models in the literature, but the downside of that is that there are more of these unknown parameters to find. Finally, the code is part of the open source software package PyBaMM. You can download it and try it for yourself. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors from Imperial College, Welong I, Ganesh Matula, Diego Alonso Alvarez, and Jacqueline Edge. I'd also like to acknowledge my external co-authors from the PyBaMM core development team, Robert Timms and Valentin Sulzer. The project leaders, Monica Marinescu, Billy Wu, and Gregory Offer. Funding from the Faraday Institution Multiscale Modeling Project, and of course the PyBaMM software itself. Thank you very much. If you made it this far, you might be interested in reading my paper. It's free for anybody to read. Link is in the description. If you still have any questions after that, my email address is s.okane@imperial.ac.uk. Thank you very much.